Welcome everybody to the Maven School and to Being Smart About Gifted Learning with Donna Matthews and Joanne Foster. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nancy Steinhauer. I'm the principal at the Maven School. And the Maven School is a small school in central Toronto where we are creating the next generation of original thinkers, adaptive leaders, and caring citizens. And at our school, we try and give all students what some people would call a gifted education, an education where the pedagogy and the curriculum are similar to what's suggested for gifted students. So we were excited to invite Donna and Joanne tonight to speak. We chose this topic because we're thinking a lot about children's mental health right now. And we know that Donna and Joanne will be talking about how important it is for program and pedagogy to match the strengths and the needs of individual children. So we think that fits in quite nicely with thinking about the whole child and how they are faring, especially during this challenging time. And now I'm going to just introduce you to Donna and Joanne. So the next slide, we have a beautiful picture. Next slide, Graham. Oh, before that. Thank you. We've got a beautiful picture of Donna and Joanne, and there are three books that they've written together. They've each written many other things apart, but these are the books they've written together. Sorry, the ABC is just Joanne's book, but Beyond Intelligence and Being Smart About Gifted Learning are books that they collaborated on. Donna is the founding director of Hunter College Center for Gifted Education and Development. She has taught at the university level and worked with children and family in schools. And she's written many books and articles and blogs for Psychology Today. And Donna has her PhD in Human Development Applied Psychology. Is that right, Donna? Yes, okay. And Joanne has a doctorate in education as well. She's a gifted education consultant. She's the author of 6 books and many articles, and she posts many of her articles on the Creativity Post. And she also works with educators and parents, specifically around issues to do with learning, motivation, creativity, and child development, all things we're really interested at the Maven School. Next slide, Graham. Tonight, we're going to hear from Donna and Joanne. They're going to talk about optimal match, best learning opportunities, and pressing concerns and questions that came in the registration process. So they've incorporated a lot of your questions into their presentation. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions through our Q&A. And if you are interested in pursuing a question further about something they've talked about, or you have a question we haven't addressed, please put it in the Q&A and we will have an opportunity to ask your questions later. And in the meantime, we'll stop periodically throughout the presentation to answer some of the key questions that came up. I just want to let you know that we are recording this presentation. We'll be sending it out shortly after tonight to those of you who have registered. And once again, we're so glad you're all here with us tonight. We're going to have a great evening. And with that, I think I can go to the next slide, Graham, and ask Donna, what is the optimal match approach? And you can see there's a few follow-up questions. What do parents and teachers need to know about giftedness? And how does this approach benefit children and school communities?
Okay, well, thank you, Nancy. I love what you're doing at the Maven School. And as you say, I think it's really consistent with what Joanne and I are talking about tonight in terms of what we're calling an optimal match approach to gifted learning. So by gifted learning, we are talking about learning that is so advanced relative to the norm that a child needs special adapted education in one or more subject areas. So kids can have gifted learning needs in creative dance or mathematics or any domain of achievement. And I think that's one of the reasons I love your school, is that you look at each learner as an individual. And that, I think, that is the essence of this approach we're talking about, an optimal match, the best possible match of learning opportunities to a child's learning needs at a particular point in time. So traditional models of gifted education are way too narrow in terms of who gets called gifted and then who gets put into special programming and then the kind of programming they get. So some kids might meet the gifted criteria, designated gifted, and are considered gifted from now and forever. And they're expected to be gifted in all subject areas. That's very rarely the case. Current research on how the brain develops, how learning abilities develop, is really clear that kids vary a lot in their areas of advancement or giftedness and in the kinds of learning opportunities they're going to benefit from. So this optimal match takes into account the dynamic nature of learning and the way the brain develops, sort of one thing at a time, an incremental approach to learning. So we're very much against the concept that some children are in the gifted category and everybody else is outside that category now and forever. Sort of once you got your IQ score, you know, the stamp on your forehead of the gifted, it doesn't really work that way in terms of real children. So the traditional model excludes way too many kids who would benefit from advanced learning opportunities in one area or another at one point in time or another. Okay, so that's sort of the basic answer to the question of the optimal match in contrast to a traditional model of thinking about giftedness. So it's very much against this optimal match approach, does not see some kids as having giftedness and some kids not. Let's see. So from an optimal match perspective, identification of special learning needs should be ongoing. It should be dynamic. It should take into account the fact that kids might learn something very quickly at a certain point in their development and then slow down either in their interest, motivation. They might have other things they're much more interested in, and that can take over. So if someone is a math whiz in the primary years, that doesn't mean you should expect them to continue to want advanced instruction as they get older. They might not. So this optimal match approach is in alignment with the emerging findings on the plasticity of the brain. The brain develops, it grows. People can get smarter if there is a good match between the child and the learning opportunities. So we know that from a number of points of view of research, certainly cognitive science, educational research, and the neuroscientific findings are all supporting this notion of individual development that is unpredictable. And you can find interest in kids and then support them in developing them. And giftedness can grow, it can develop. So that's a big contrast to traditional, more static models of what intelligence is, what giftedness is. So this optimal match approach, one of the real benefits is it totally avoids categorizing kids. So back to what you were saying earlier about the Maven School's approach, it looks at every child as having special abilities, giftedness in one area or another. And so the job of a teacher or a parent, I think, is to look for and support any kinds of interest in kids with the idea that you may be nurturing giftedness or you may not. That's giftedness per se, I don't think is a valuable outcome. You know, I'm not thinking that it's a good thing. But I do think what's important is engaging kids in the learning process and giving them a chance to develop their abilities, whatever they are. The optimal match approach is a lot more flexible, obviously, which requires a real flexibility of mind in teachers and parents. You know, it's not like you can decide this is an advanced kid, this is a normal kid, this is a slow kid, and that will be true through their schooling. It's not true. And it's certainly not true across all subject areas either. In order to implement this approach, it does require like pretty serious teacher training, because traditional models of giftedness are, you know, as I've talked about, are really, this contrasts significantly with that. One of the interesting things that I have learned in my own professional work, and that you talk about, Nancy, in your book, Pushing the Limits, is that Indigenous approaches to understanding giftedness are very, and I'm wearing red today, it's the Missing and Murdered is Wear a Red Dress Day. The Indigenous approaches to giftedness are completely aligned with our optimal match approach and completely misaligned with traditional understandings of what giftedness is. So that's just an interesting, what I'm saying there, what I've learned from my work in teaching graduate students is that the students that I've had who are from Indigenous backgrounds completely get this approach, whereas other educators often have trouble getting it. So it's an interesting fact. So I think I've answered that question. So I guess next slide. Oh, I should have asked already. Graham, could you go through my slides and let's see what I've forgotten. Okay. Yep, I think that's good. Next slide, please. Next, Graham. Thanks. Sorry, Anderson. Okay. And the next one, please. All right. Oh, yeah. One thing that I didn't talk about yet, which I've sort of alluded to, but a while back in my own learning, because I started off very much I learned about a traditional approach to assessing intelligence, all of the traditional approaches to giftedness. So it was my dissatisfaction with that led me to move into a very different perspective. At some point, I realized that it is important to give kids who have gifted learning needs an education that matches their abilities, but it's, I think, more exciting to use what we know about how giftedness develops to encourage giftedness more broadly in the population. Okay, so the next slide, please. So, goal of gifted education: to find and implement the optimal educational match for your child's interests and abilities, remembering to keep it flexible because these targets change over time. We want to empower children and teens so they can find a healthy balance in their lives, one that nurtures their abilities and fosters their well-rounded development. So it's not all about knowing math facts or being able to write a good essay. There's a whole lot more that goes into it. This optimal match is much more a lifespan development approach. Okay, next slide, please.
Great. And so I'm going to ask Joanne that question, but can I ask you one thing before we go on, Donna?
Yeah,
and that is, I remember reading in Beyond Intelligence that there's actually some evidence that being given that label of giftedness can be harmful in a way. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, because one of the questions that was asked before this presentation by one of the registrants was, what are the pros and cons of testing? What are the pros and cons of identification? Can you speak to
Right.
that just before we
Yeah, I
move on
mean,
to Joanne?
okay, sure. Those are like very big topics. Each one of them could like take 6 hours, as you know. Pros and cons of testing, very quickly, condensed version. My recommendation is you don't want to test unless there's a reason to test. If you have a reason to think there's something that's not going well for your child, then you might want to think about getting them tested. Yeah, an assessment can yield useful data, but kids who are quirky might approach a testing situation and have fun with the answers. And you're not going to get sort of their best, highest score. You're going to get something else going on. So there are, and that's just one reason. There's a lot of reasons that test scores don't often don't represent a kid's true ability. So I'm very suspicious of test scores unless they align really well with what parents and teachers have seen in the child already. So that's a really quick answer. You do better to go to Joanne's and my first book, well, the new version of the Being Smart book. The first one was published in 2005, I think. But the next one is coming out in the fall. We go into those details of tests and assessments and labeling really well. We do talk about it, though, in Beyond Intelligence, which is available now. Pros and cons of labeling. The only pro, as far as I'm concerned, is that sometimes the label, the gifted label, is necessary to get the programming a kid needs, right? So if a kid is out of sync, and they wouldn't need it at the Maven school, because you're looking at every kid as potentially gifted in every area. So you have a different approach than normal. But in virtually every school else, a kid might need that label in order to get the advanced enriched instruction they really need. Okay, so that's the benefit. The negatives, I think, are typically way stronger. So a kid, like for me, one of the most powerful negatives, Carol Dweck's work on mindsets sort of explains why the gifted label is problematic for so many kids. It leads them to have higher expectations of themselves and different expectations of themselves than they should. It leads them to think that there is something static and special about them. They're different than others. When they think about that and they look at the world and their own functioning, they realize that really they're just kids. Some things come easy and some things do not. So they often get what I've seen too much of is kids get insecure about protecting that label. There's a fear that they're an imposter. They feel like they've been mislabeled. And so there's a rigidity that can set in. It can be a damaging thing to get that label. Requires a lot of, if your kid is labeled gifted, because they need the programming, then I think it's really important for parents and teachers to help that kid understand that what that means is they're better at learning some school subjects. It's easier for them than other kids. Everybody has strengths. Everybody has weaknesses. They happen to have some academic strengths, and this is a good program for them. But they've got other areas where they're not so weak, not so strong. And the people who don't get that gifted label are probably way smarter than them in one area or another. So that's how to help if your kid does have the label.
Thank you. Thanks for speaking to that, Donna.
Okay.
Okay, so my next question is for Joanne. How can parents nurture children's high-level development? And there's a couple of sub-questions there that Joanne's going to address as we move through the presentation.
Hi, thank you for having us, first of all, and for the lovely introduction, which was a while ago, but still resonated. So thank you so much. There are a lot of questions on that particular page. So what I'm going to do over the next little while is just attack each one briefly for a couple of minutes, and then if there are additional questions after, people can just raise them. So Graham, if you don't mind going to the first slide, um, the topic there has to do with the impactful factors. What is it that really has an effect on a child's learning? And there are a number of points there that I wanted to speak to briefly. One is whether or not the child feels that there is a value to what it is that they're doing. If it's meaningful, they're going to be more inclined to do it than if it's not relevant to them at all. If they're interested in it, that is also a major factor. The age and the maturity of a child will have a bearing upon whether or not they feel the particular task or activity is suited for them. Whether or not they can manage a particular task is important too. And that includes whether or not they can complete it, or even work their way through it, often in a given time frame, because the reality is we put time constraints on things all the time. And sometimes if a particular demand is not manageable by a child, they will balk. They will have difficulty getting down to work and feeling motivated about it. A child's skill level and their own feeling, their own self-efficacy, the sense of whether or not they can accomplish something will have a bearing upon their learning. Outside influences is another factor. What's going on around them? What would they perhaps rather be doing? Is it sunny outside? Is there a noise level? Is it too hot? Is everybody else having snack and they're not? There can be very many reasons. And these outside influences, by the way, are not only in school, they're also at home. There are so many things now with kids learning at home that are having an impact on that particular learning environment that tends to cause them to, be distracted or drift away. Rules and expectations can have a bearing on children's learning. So whether or not they feel the rules are too constrictive or too lax. Some children work better when things are very stringent. Other kids like a more unstructured type of setting. Whether or not the expectations are suitable. And by expectations, those may be set by the teacher, by the parent, by the child, him or herself. So those have to be kept in mind so that they're appropriate for the child. And of course, so what's happening within the child, their own ambition, their temperament, their attitudes, their foresight. And this is just a short list of items. There are other things that also have an impact on learning. For example, whether a child is prepared, how resourceful they are, what kinds of social, emotional things are going on in their lives, their own well-being, their coping mechanisms, especially we're talking now in a COVID reality, and how well they're managing that. How busy they are. If they're too busy, they may not want to do something. Their own adaptability, their work habits, past experiences, and how successful they were at a similar task. All of these things have an impact on learning. So you can see it's not just simple. It's not just that we sit down and we learn. We have to sit down and we have to learn, but we have to take into consideration all of these other factors as well. Graham, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. I just want to talk very briefly about differentiation, which is a particular process that a lot of teachers use, and that is certainly very welcoming and is part of an opportunity-rich environment. There are very many ways to differentiate children's programming. I know that Nancy, in your school, you guys are masters at this. But basically, it's a way to be inclusive of everybody's learning needs. It's respectful of people's ability levels. It's responsive to their individuality. And in being smart about gifted learning, Donna and I actually have 2 full chapters that just deal with differentiation and all the various different types of differentiation. So it might be involving career learning. It might have to do with project-based learning. It might have to do with dealing with specific book projects. Mentorships. There are all kinds of different ways to differentiate. So I can tell you, I think we have close to 20 in there that we describe and discuss. And the key word there, differentiation, it being different, making sure that we are responsive to the needs of the individual students, and that we enable them to master their learning objectives. And we are dealing with kids at all different ranges. So it's a tricky job for a teacher. And again, what Donna mentioned before about having to make sure that teachers receive the right kind of training and professional development, that's really crucial for differentiation, especially given that there are so many possibilities. And of course, there's such a wide spectrum of learning in any classroom. Next slide, please, Graham, if you don't mind. This is some of the these are just some options. I mentioned mentorships. Curriculum compacting is something that often happens prior to any kind of differentiation, where the teacher takes the material and compacts it in a way that the child learns it quickly and then has additional time in which to be able to tackle other learning opportunities. Acceleration, I think there's something like 23 different types of acceleration where children can move into a higher grade level or a higher ability level in a particular subject or in many subjects. And there are certain times where it may be more conducive for a child to do that, such as when they're changing from for example, primary into the elementary, or elementary into middle school, or middle school into high school. There are certain transition times. Anyways, there's tons of stuff on acceleration out there. And I should say also that there are some people who are not inclined to like acceleration, and yet the research tells us that for many children, this is a good opportunity for them to learn. Extracurriculars, these have been short-circuited over the course of COVID for a lot of children, unfortunately. And yet for some kids, it's also opened up because we have a lot more online possibilities than we had before. And kids are finding amazing ways to collaborate with their friends and come up with new ways of learning and extending the kinds of things that they're interested in that may start as hobbies and may ultimately become a more serious pursuit for them. Independent study, which is something that, again, we're doing a lot of now because of the COVID situation. And again, that requires parents and teachers to keep close eyes on what it is that the child is doing. And I did mention career exploration as well. Other possibilities include outdoor education, flexible grouping, internships, volunteerism, and community involvement. Lots of good things going on, both through schools and through homes that parents are aware of. Cross-grade resources where students check with what's going on in other grades and pick up on certain ideas. Travel, even virtual travel, and even time to do nothing, time just to get bored and sit and reflect and find out what it is you want to do more of. That can also be a very valuable time for kids. And of course, homeschooling and all the different hybrid versions of that. So lots of possibilities for optimal match as long as people go about it in a sensible and thoughtful way. Next slide, please, Graham, if you don't mind. If you're going to make the learning experiences really meaningful for kids, the best thing to do, first of all, is to offer them choice, to make sure that the challenge is appropriate, and to think about the expectations, activities, and adaptations. So let's just start here for a second with expectations. They need to be relevant, they need to be doable, and they should be aligned with a child's levels of readiness, their interests, and also whatever areas of strength they may have, which could be in flux and could be different from one particular subject area to another. Expectations should be clear. They should be inspiring. They should motivate the child. They should be reachable, because if they can't reach them, then they are likely not going to want to aspire toward them. And they should be realistic. They should be something that the child feels that, this is something that's fair and fitting to what it is that I can do. Activities should be such that they're not so long that the child feels they're never going to get to the end of them, but not so short and simple either that there's no challenge. So you have to find that middle ground. And the adaptations will vary as the child is going through the journey of learning. Things may need to be fixed up along the way. So you may want to monitor, you may want to reinforce, you may want to praise, you may want to backtrack, you may want to start over again. So again, the adaptations are things that you have to sort of monitor as you go. Through all of this, teachers require support. They need to be able to tap into a range of curricular options and instructional approaches and resources. So it's very important that teachers be encouraged by parents to take advantage of the possibilities for professional development. This is actually Teacher Appreciation Week. I posted an article yesterday on Creativity Post, and I invite everybody to take a look at that. I applaud teachers for all it is they do, and I ask parents to please collaborate and advocate for their learning needs and help teachers by showing them the gratitude that I think they deserve, because this is hard. I mean, differentiating and enlivening learning experiences and doing all it is that the teachers do is it's a calling. It's truly a calling. Next slide, please, Graham, if you don't mind. I just want to sort of sum this up just a little bit. This is something directly out of Being Smart about gifted learning. And Donna and I call this the 5 R's. It's as important for parents as it is for teachers. And as you look at them, you might wonder, is this appropriate for students too? So let's just take a quick look. So the first is you want to be resourceful. As a parent, as a teacher, you want to find the information that you need. You want to be able to think about it. You want to be able to apply it intelligently. You want to be reasonable. In other words, you want to make sure that whatever it is that you're asking children to do is something that they can do and feel good about along the way, and also once they've accomplished something. You want to be receptive to change, because nothing ever stays the same. In this particular day and age, especially, everything is just on the fly, and we're all doing the best we can, and change is inevitable. So in fact, the subtitle to our book is Empowering Parents and Kids Through Challenge and Change. And boy, has this ever been a time of challenge and change. Being responsive to questions is really important. One of the things that I write about a lot is inquiry and helping children to formulate questions and know how to do them sort of one at a time, so they're not bombarding their teacher or their parents, but come across with a question that's thoughtful, and you will receive a thoughtful answer. Come across with a question that's just a yes/no question, and you're going to get a yes/no answer. So it's important to have that curiosity, but to be able to express yourself in a way that your questions will garner a meaningful answer. And finally, this one is really key. This one is to be respectful. To be respectful of others, to hope that you're going to receive that same respect in return, and being respectful of feelings and opinions and children's motivations, which are all different, and their abilities and their choices, which we talked about before, and their sense of self. We want them to become more invested in their own learning, and the only way that that's going to happen is if we're respectful of them and we respond to them honestly and in ways that they in turn can respond back to. So I think that's it for my particular segment, that I'm going to stop here. And I think, Nancy, maybe you want to have some questions put forth? Or?
I do. I have a bunch of questions. Plus, if anybody in the audience has questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. It's funny, we're talking about questions. I met Donna about 20 years ago. I was taking her graduate course in the psychology of gifted education, I believe. And I had a seminar to do. And I said, Donna, like, I don't know what to do. Like first of all the people who were drawn to this class were very bright and dynamic. And I was very nervous. And she said, if you can ask one good question, then you have done your job. So that's always stayed with me as a teacher and as a principal. If I can ask one good question, then I feel like I've done my job. And that's also central to our approach at the Maven School, where the students' questions guide our curriculum. In fact, our teachers don't know what they're going to be teaching when they step in the door in September, because they need to be with the children and see what they want to learn. So very interesting to make that, to think back on that. One of the questions that's come up from the participants in the registration is, how do you, when a student has two exceptionalities, so let's say a student has been assessed and they've been identified as gifted, but they also have a learning disability, or maybe they have ADHD, or maybe they're somewhere on the spectrum, or any number of possibilities of where there are two things going on. So you've got this very strong intellect, and at the same time some real gaps in what the student's able to do in terms of skills. Could maybe one or both of you comment on how does the teacher and how does the parent find the optimal match for that student?
You want to go ahead, Donna? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually, that circumstance is one of the reasons that the optimal match approach is, in my opinion, so much better than a traditional approach, because from an optimal match perspective, you don't need to get identified as one or the other. One of the things that I've seen too often happening is that one exceptionality is identified and then the other is ignored. So you get kids who are really good at sort of early test taking, the oral test taking that intelligence tests give. And so they do well enough to get into a gifted program, but they have a learning disability. And reading and writing is really hard for them. And they're not able to keep up in the gifted class. There's a terrible mismatch between their abilities and what they're being given. So what this optimal match approach does is it encourages a teacher and a parent too, who understands the idea of making sure that the gifted level learning needs are met. So the kid has, let's say there's an intense curiosity about science, so that's supported and developed and focused on, so that's the strongest focus. And then you pull in the areas of disability or problems. The child that I've just described, so the science strengths and a reading, writing disability. So what you do is you use science resources to get the kid starting to, encouraged to learn to make sense of print, and then to begin to slowly learn how to do the writing. So you pull in the weaknesses with the strengths. So you don't ignore one or the other. It's imperative that both the strengths and the weaknesses are addressed. I mean, from a traditional perspective, I think a lot of teachers see the disability as more important than the giftedness. And I would go just the opposite direction. I would see the giftedness as more important than the disability.
One thing I would add to that, and you're right on target, perfect answer. I would just like to say that I think that there's a piece here that can be brought in that would be pertinent to whatever level the child is working at, and that is the creativity factor. Because choice is so important for children when they're learning, I think we have an opportunity to really maximize their creativity. And a child is able to be creative whether or not they have issues in terms of their learning or they don't have issues. We build creativity from what we know, but everybody knows something. So we have a common foundation from where to build. And I think if teachers work towards helping children use their creativity and grow their independence by using their creativity and enjoy the learning process through their creativity, that's a real plus. And it's just straightforward from there. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Thank you. And I really like your point, Donna, about sometimes we focus so much on the learning disability that we don't give kids what they need in terms of the cognitive challenge. And I've seen that sometimes in withdrawal programs. Sometimes with withdrawal programs, people become so focused on what the children are missing that they lose sight of what the children have. And so
and then the child does too. I mean, it can be
right.
tragic. So a kid feels like a total failure. They're in this special class for losers in their own mind, and their mind doesn't get a chance to, as Joanne was saying, get creatively engaged.
Right.
I think that's huge. That's a really important dimension of it.
And again, and Joanne, along with what you were saying about the creativity, it's something that I love about our model at our school, which is we have kids in our school who have learning disabilities, who are gifted, who have been identified as gifted, who are socially adept, who socially struggle more. They're all together, and we have special education teachers who go into the classroom and work with all the students so that everybody's getting the benefit of the support and everybody's getting the benefit of the enrichment and the creativity and you know, all of those important skills and talents that might otherwise be missed.
Right. And I think that learning is about discovery. And the only way you're going to discover is if you push yourself a little bit. And I think that in terms of creativity, it enables children to develop problem solving skills and ways to um, find a new approach to things that they might be having difficulty with. So we're enabling them in that way. Um, I think that one of the most important things any child has is their curiosity, and that's what we need to continue to nurture. So having a label is like that's not the issue. The issue is what are we doing to help this child um, develop their curiosity, develop their creativity, develop their knowledge base, build from there. And in the process, we have to be flexibly responsive on a day-to-day basis to wherever it is they are in their learning.
Exactly. And um, it's so interesting because one of the things that I kind of marvel at our teachers is they really don't know what they're going to. I mean, they have kind of a plan, but they have to go through the experience with the students before they really know what they're going to do. And so that's exciting. I'm seeing some really interesting questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask you one of those. This one is about testing and assessment, but it's about the participant writes, nowadays parents can get access to resources that would position their kids for gifted assessment when the time comes. I guess some parents are training their children to, pass the psychoeducational assessment. And if the child responds to a learning program positively, would you as a parent not be positioning them better? So I think what the participant is getting at is a gifted program always the best choice? Can teachers in regular classrooms provide suitable adaptations? And how much is too much in terms of pushing children if we do see a glimpse of talent in something?
Okay, I used to do a lot of assessment. I had a psychoeducational practice for decades. And so I've worked with like a really wide variety of kids in a number of different circumstances. And I've seen it happen that, I mean, it's unscrupulous to put your kid through a training program for a gifted assessment. It's considered illegitimate. It's not acceptable from psychological best practice. But there are people who provide it. And, a parent can go into it thinking they're doing a good thing for their kid. They're giving their kid an advantage and getting them into a higher status program. And what I've seen happen and is tragic is you can get a very competent kid prepared so they do better on the test. And yeah, you can help them do better on the test. That is a doable thing. And then they go into an environment. They've been in an environment where they're one of the top kids in the class. They go into an environment where they're the bottom kid in the class, or among the bottom few. So they've been a star in their own environment, and then it's ruinous. It's destructive. So no, you're not doing your kid a favor by preparing them to do an intelligence test. I think the whole model of doing an intelligence test to get into a special class is crazy. That, as I've talked about already. So the whole model, I think, is very flawed. But preparing your kid to get into it, I would highly recommend against it. I don't think you're doing your kid a favor.
And in relation to the other part of the question about, is it possible to appropriately teach students of different levels in a regular classroom? The answer is absolutely yes. I mean, that's what the optimal match approach is all about. It's about differentiating for individual children's needs in different ways, keeping in mind that those will change, and there will certainly be some areas of strength and some areas of weakness, but we all have areas of strength and weakness. Name one person who can do everything well. I can't think of anybody.
And that really is a nice segue to the next question, Joanne, which is what you're describing as the ideal situation is really, this person is saying, antithetical to the public school system, how the public school system works in Toronto. It has a designated gifted program, which has admission by a test. Optimal match is really a private school thing here, it seems. And I wonder if you could speak to your perspectives on the role of public education if optimal match is only available in a private setting. Is this something you worry about or consider in your work? And I just want to say, as a former public school principal, I disagree with the supposition that optimal match is antithetical to public schools, because I've seen teachers do amazing jobs differentiating
Yep.
in public school classrooms. I just want to put
Yep.
that out there.
And
And now I'll let you respond.
I totally agree with you, Nancy. In my general perspective on this is that public school teachers have a typical public school teacher versus a typical private school teacher. I will take the public school teacher all day long. They are much more likely to have been given training in special ed, so they understand differentiation, adaptive instruction. They're more likely to have that foundation. They're more likely to have that mindset that their job is about adapting to kids' learning needs, because their classrooms are full of diverse learning needs. It's typically not a select group. So if you've got a good teacher in a public school, then they intuitively understand, and especially if they've had some training, some support in special ed, adapting, and are given the resources they need to do it, because as you'll know really well from all of your experience, like you've been at a lot of different schools, it does take a lot of support for a teacher to do a good job with the diversity of learners that they encounter every day. They need support. They need resources in place that they can use. So the Maven School is an exception. So our optimal match approach is absolutely applicable to public school settings. I've seen it done right. I've seen you do it right, Nancy. I've seen other good educators do it right in public systems.
One thing I would like to say in addition to that is whether or not the parent community is supportive and is advocating for the kinds of things that children need, whether it's public school, whether it's private school. You need connectivity among the parents. You need connectivity between home and school. You need administrative support for teachers, because any class, no matter whether it's a public school or a private school, that learning environment is only as good as the teacher who's pulling together all the different learning opportunities and making that environment motivating and enjoyable and targeted to the individual learning needs of the kids. So,
Okay, I'm going to ask you another question. If there's a mismatch between a child and the learning environment, how long do you suggest waiting? Do you wait a month? Do you wait a year until you take action by either changing the program or changing schools, or maybe there are other ways you can take action?
I mean, and that is something that we spend a lot of time talking about in being smart about gifted learning. It's incredibly variable. It varies from one situation to the next, and from one child to the next, one school, one teacher. There's way too complex. It's very individual. The thing that I have discovered to be most important is a principal who understands the concepts we're talking about here today. So if you've got a principal who understands them, you are almost certainly going to get, that kid is going to get their learning needs met. You as a parent may need to be an advocate for that happening, but it will happen. That's the single most important thing, is the school culture, which is typically embodied in the principal.
one thing I would add in terms of when to really pay attention is to really be attuned to your child, to know about the red flags, to see how your child is responding, if there are social emotional issues, behavioral issues, motivational issues, whether or not your child is becoming lethargic, whether or not they're not sleeping well, not eating well, unkempt appearance, just some of those issues that sort of are triggers for you as a parent to know that this child is not functioning well, this child is not happy, and that should be a signal as a parent to take a look and say maybe it's time to maybe look a little closer. And I think given the fact that we have this pandemic going on and everybody is feeling lethargic and frustrated and angry and anxious and all that, it's that much harder, I think, to recognize when a child is really going through an extremely challenging or difficult time. So parents have to be available. They have to be good listeners. They have to be ready to comfort and have the resources handy that they need. They need to be good observers. I mean, you can often tell from a child's posture or tone of voice or way of being whether or not there's something that's just awry and not right. And if you've got as a parent that gut sense that something is off, it may be a time to speak with a pediatrician, a counselor, a professional, especially if it's something that's really concerning, if it's a red flag that's very concerning.
And I would just add that I've had vastly different experiences as a principal and as a parent. So as a principal, I would always say, speak to the school, work through it with the school. Oftentimes as a school, we aren't seeing the same things as you are, and you know your children in a way that we will never know your children. So it's really important that we work together and don't jump to a solution of changing things before you've had a chance to really work it through with the school. But I will say, as a parent who had a quirky child, I often found it difficult to work with the school. So, finding your allies at the school is really important. And I think Donna's right that often the principal can help you navigate the system in a way that's going to be helpful to you and your child. So interesting questions. And there was a clarification here that the question I asked previously about public schools, they were talking specifically about pull-out programs as opposed to the idea of optimal match in any given program. So before we ask our last closing question, do you have any comments about pull-out gifted programs? Different boards do it different ways. Different boards have different cutoffs, different criteria. What are your thoughts about gifted programming, in this day and age? Jan, you want to go first?
Yeah,
you look passionate.
Yeah, you know what? I did those programs for a number of years. I was the actual itinerant gifted teacher for many, many years for a school board. And honestly, these kids are not just gifted on Tuesday afternoons at 3:00 for an hour. And a lot of these pull-out programs are not really tied in well to other kinds of things that are happening in the classroom. And these kids come out of their classroom and then they miss stuff that's important in the classroom. So, I mean, there are just a lot of downsides. It happens. There are some good enrichment type of pull-out programs that are happening out there, I'm sure. But my gut feeling is that this is probably not the best way to go. Donna, I'll let you.
Oh yeah, totally. I 100% agree. And you have the experience as the teacher in that classroom. The theoretically speaking, what is the connection between a pull-out program and optimal match? There is no connection. You're not addressing any learning need for a kid other than perhaps they've scored high on an intelligence test or a cognitive achievement test. So what is the connection between that score and the pull-out program? There isn't one. And as Joanne said, and this is, so the kid is disrupted in their learning. Often the teacher, their full-time teacher, they're put in the position of losing their kid for half a day or whatever. It doesn't make any sense. There's no harmony for the child. So it's not a programming approach that I would ever recommend.
Now, I was always dead set against sending my child to a gifted program. And then he got to grade 3 and I could see him losing interest in school. And I changed my mind and I ended up sending him to a gifted program.
But it
for the
was a
next,
full-time program,
a
right?
full-time program.
See,
And
that's yeah, sorry.
do you want to speak to that, Donna?
No, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say was, so he was in a gifted program for 3 years, and his experience very much depended on the teacher. So there were some teachers teaching that program who really got him and understood what he needed, and there were other teachers who really didn't. And you know, he had a great time when he connected with the teacher, had good relationships with the teacher, and the teacher had high expectations and really had thought through about how to teach him. And then there were other teachers who had been placed into gifted programs because they had a special education qualification, but hadn't really thought about that whole idea of optimal match. And so it wasn't really any more engaging than anywhere else. So do you want to give a final word
Yeah,
on
no,
on
that's
that?
exactly. And I would say in response to that, the full-time programs can work magic in a given child's life. And as you say, it's very dependent on the teacher's training and support and resources, you know, who the teacher is and what they see their job to be. So that it can work really well. Can also give the kid more intellectual stimulation. As you were saying with your child, he wasn't doing well in the regular program, I expect, because he just wasn't learning enough, and he was curious, he wanted to learn. So he was in an environment where there was more of that going on, so he could thrive. So it can work. It's not the best approach, in my opinion. I think something much more integrated and diverse, like what you offer at the Maven School, and I have seen at other public schools too. I think that's, for me, that's the best.
Yeah, and of course there's advantages that come from either being in a special program or being at a private school, that sometimes the classes are smaller. There may be more time for the teachers or support for the teachers.
But it can work, as you know, it
can.
can absolutely work in a larger class.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've seen it.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask Graham to go to the next slide, which is our closing question, because I could sit here. Oh, sorry, the one after that, Graham. I could sit here all night talking to you. One more, Graham. One back.
No, I think one more.
There we go. This is the one I wanted. Closing question. Okay, so this will be our last question, and then we'll say our thank yous. But last question. This is certainly a challenging time for everybody. What strategies can help families flourish during difficult times? And Graham, could you go to the next slide, please?
So we've basically divided these up into one slide that has some of the top priorities for parents, and then some that are for kids. So I'll read the parents one, and I'll let Donna go through the ones for the children, and then we just have a wrap up side that's sort of for everybody. The first is in terms of parents, look after yourself. Put on your own oxygen mask first before you try and deal with your child. That's really important. Rely on your support networks, whether it's community, whether it's other parents, whether it's your family, the school administration, whoever you need to contact, let them help you. You can't do everything solo. Knowing that change is inevitable, especially now. So have that flexibility, that sensitivity, that ability to listen and learn from your child in order to know what it is that they need. Have faith in your own abilities as a parent. You're doing the best job you can, and just keep at it. If you have faith in yourself, then you'll move forward that much more confidently. Find the moments that matter with your family, because those are what really count. Whether or not your child does the multiplication tables or finishes the picture or whatever it is, that's not as important as having those family moments that are really going to matter, because in the whole scheme of things, they'll be able to do a multiplication table and draw a picture. But those moments, if you don't capture them when you can, they disappear very quickly. And as a parent, take on what it is that you can manage. Don't try and do everything at once. Learning is incremental. It happens step by step. And everything that you do as a parent, learning as a parent, also happens step by step. So modulate yourself. Take the time you need to get through your day, to do what it is that you need to do, whether it's reflect, exercise, get a walk, go outside for some fresh air. Just focus on your own abilities, your own intellectual growth, your own creative growth, because your child will learn from seeing you take on those responsibilities just as much as it is doing anything else, if not more. So Graham, next slide, and Donna can talk about priorities for kids.
So yeah, what to encourage at home. And as Joanne said, this is all particularly true now. In Toronto, well, in all of Ontario, we have, for the last 2 months of the school year, kids are still at home and not at real school, and it's really tough. So relationships, the single most important thing is your kids' relationships with you, with their friends, and if you have to do it by Zoom or whatever, it's very painful for children missing their friends, but relationships are the core value. So that's, that should take priority over everything else, over, as Joanne said, finishing a piece of work or attending a Zoom school day. It's relationships should come first. There's interests, abilities, and talents. That's something we've been talking about all evening. And sort of keep your focus on what's your kid interested in? Give them whatever support you can to develop that. Interests become abilities, which can become talents or real strengths. Make sure your kid feels safe. So places and relationships of safety and trust are an important emphasis to encourage for kids. Learning from setbacks. That's, again, back to Carol Dweck. That's one of the things about the growth mindset that I love. And so what she talks about is learn to welcome failure. If you can welcome the setbacks, help your child learn when they're not getting it, when they're frustrated, learn to welcome those moments as opportunities to learn what you need to do better, what you need to do next to get better. So learning from setbacks is very critical to mental health for us all, but very much for children. So building upon emotional capacities. Talked earlier about the gifted LD or any other combination of strengths. So finding out what your kids, paying attention to what their emotional capacities are, their current levels, and then building upon that in terms of the self-regulation skills and confidence. Embrace their strengths, develop their confidence. By embracing their strengths and supporting them in developing competence, that's the best way for them to develop confidence. You can't give somebody confidence. You can support them in developing their own strengths so that they develop confidence. Less pressure, not having to dazzle. Joanne wrote these slides, and she uses words like dazzle, and I love it. It wakes it up. So less pressure. So I'm writing a book right now. The title is Imperfect Parenting. And I'm talking a lot about reduce the pressure on yourself, reduce the pressure on your kid. Nobody has to dazzle. Just do what's interesting to you. And that is really, really good enough. It's great. And then finally, and perhaps coming around the circle, it's certainly just as important as anything else, look for life balance for your kid as much as you can. And it's very hard right now, but including family engagements, their learning, what they're actually learning, their health, their friends, values, responsibilities. Do your best for balance.
Right.
So Graham, I guess we need the next slide.
Yes.
So Joanne, do you want to do that?
Sure. These are just basic coping non-negotiables, I guess you could say, especially now when we're dealing with all that we're dealing with the pandemic. So the first is, of course, to safeguard your family health. Use your time and space wisely. So whatever it is that you have to do, everybody's working at home. Kids are working, parents are working. You need a niche, you need a space. Make sure that everybody feels that their time and space is equally valued and has that in order to be able to function.
I'm going to interrupt, Joanne. If you're very lucky, you're working at home.
Yeah, well, there's that too, but yeah,
Yeah.
true. You're right.
So
Yes, attunement to your child. So making sure that they have opportunities to explore their interests, multisensory opportunities, opportunities to play. They're still kids, break time, and so forth. Connections with others. So that goes back to the relationships, staying calm, being proactive, not just, sitting there, but being aware of what your child needs, and being aware enough to get whatever resources or support mechanisms in place that you might need. Strengthening that family circle, and finally to embrace optimism, because there is hope. There is a tomorrow. There is we will get through this. It may not feel like it every single day, and it does get difficult, but if as adults we are optimistic, then certainly that will help. Graham, I'm just going to go to the next slide for 1 second, if you don't mind, please. There are two complementary resources that are available on the publisher's website, Gifted Unlimited. And if you go there and you scroll down to the end, you'll see the complementary ones. So the first one is A to Z for Parents, Coping Today, Moving Forward Tomorrow. And this is a book of resource material. It's a booklet, an e-booklet actually, to help parents get through this pandemic, the difficult times. And the other particular guide that you see there is the productivity guide, resource for families, for kids who don't feel motivated during this time. That's not a question that came up. I thought it might, but in any case, this is for anybody who's interested. There are 50 strategies in there. Some involve thinking, some involve feeling, some involve acting, but just ways in which kids can get themselves going and feel motivated and get through this next while in order to be as happily productive as they might be.
And the next slide shows off your books. Next slide, Graham. We've got Beyond Intelligence, which is already published, and then Being Smart About Gifted Learning is being republished and updated. And on this slide, there are codes for discounts, and Being Smart About Gifted Learning will come out in the fall. And tonight we are going to do a draw for 5 people to get a free copy of Beyond Intelligence. Michelle Barchuk, how are we going to do that draw? Are we going to do it afterwards?
Yes, I think so. We are going to draw random numbers and we will reach out to the 5 winners.
We will reach out and find a contactless way to get those books to you. Joanne?
Yes, I just want to say, for anybody who does not win a book tonight, I don't want you to feel like a loser. If you go to my website, which is joannefoster.ca, and you go to the resources page, you will be a winner, because you will find gazillions of resources on anything and everything related to what we discussed tonight: learning, creativity, productivity, assessment, you name it, it's there. joannefoster.ca, and anything that's marked with a little red asterisk is specific to COVID. So go for it. And
thank you, Joanne.
Enjoy. My
Free
pleasure.
stuff. We like that.
Free stuff.
And last slide, Graham. We want to thank all of you for joining us. We want to thank Donna and Joanne. I think what I got most out of this evening was a reinforcement that all students deserve the kind of teaching that's recommended for gifted students, that optimal match. It's an art and a science. It's not easy. Teachers are amazing. It is Teacher Appreciation Week. You know, the teachers intuitively make so many little adjustments and design curriculum in a way that students will be stretched and can go as far as they can go and support the students who need the support. And so a big thank you to all teachers, a big thank you to all parents for supporting your children the way you are in a very challenging time. A big thank you to our speakers, Donna and Joanne, for inspiring us tonight. And we welcome any of you who haven't visited our website to visit our website at maven.com. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Donna and Joanne are also excellent people to follow on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we wish you a safe a few weeks ahead before you get your vaccine if you haven't had it already. And here's to being back in school as soon as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.